Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are going to play the role of historical detectives, and we're looking into a pretty incredible mystery. Basically, how on earth did early human civilizations manage to study life, understand disease, and treat human health completely without any of the modern technology we take for granted today?
Right, let's dive into this massive historical question, because honestly, it completely changes how we view early medicine and philosophy. Just imagine for a second trying to figure out a really complex disease or the anatomy of a living creature, but you have no microscope, absolutely no laboratory, and zero knowledge of genetics. Where do you even start to make sense of the natural world? Well, as you'll see, the systems our ancestors actually came up with to solve this problem were nothing short of absolute genius.
To figure that out, we're taking a global tour. We'll start with what pre-modern biology is, then look at Eastern traditional medical systems, dive into ancient Egyptian medical rigor, check out the Greek philosophical revolution, and end with a massive ideological showdown, Plato versus Aristotle.
Section 1. What is pre-modern biology? Let's kick things off with the absolute basics of how our ancestors started making sense of the world around them.
So, the absolutely crucial thing to remember here is that early scholars had to rely entirely on their direct physical senses. Without cell theory or controlled lab experiments to fall back on, people basically studied life by just intensely observing organisms, describing their physical features, and then systematically classifying them. They would record the habits, the habitats, and the uses of living things, and then they painstakingly passed all this knowledge down through books, traditions, and oral histories. It was biology in its absolute rawest, most direct form.
And this basically gives us the three pillars of pre-modern biology. This is the toolkit that set the stage for how all ancient cultures began to codify the world. First up, you have observation. That means systematically noticing and recording characteristics or behaviors, using just your eyes, your ears, and your sense of touch. Second is classification, which is that vital process of grouping these organisms together based on what they actually have in common and how they differ. And third, natural history. This means studying these organisms right out there in their own natural environments, just watching how they interact with nature. Simple, right? But incredibly effective.
Section 2. Eastern Traditional Medical Systems. Armed with these three pillars of observation, we're going to turn to the East to see how this toolkit was practically applied in some of the oldest medical traditions in the world.
Now, what's really fascinating here is Ayurveda. This is considered one of the oldest traditional systems of medicine, and it's been flourishing since the 2nd century BC. Tracing its foundations all the way back to ancient Hindu philosophical schools and the Vedas, Ayurveda fundamentally believed the human body was intrinsically, intimately tied to nature. They observed that humans were basically composed of 5 universal elements: Vayu, which is air; Jal, or water; Akash, meaning space; Prithvi, for earth; and Teja, which is fire. They recognized this incredibly deep, dynamic relationship between our human body constitution and these very elements of the universe acting in perfect coordination. And building off of those elements, Ayurvedic healers created a beautifully structured biological system by categorizing bodily functions into the 3 doshas. So you have Vata, which manages transport and waste elimination, then Pitta, which regulates your overall body temperature, and Kapha, which handles the lubrication of your joints. Through pure, raw observation, they basically deduced that any imbalance of these 3 specific doshas was the direct root cause of illness and disease. It is just a remarkably comprehensive way to map out human health without ever once looking at a single cell.
Meanwhile, you have traditional Chinese medicine. This is a system that's at least 23 centuries old, with written records like the Huangdi Neijing dating way back to the 3rd century BCE. And they frame their observations just a little bit differently. They focused heavily on restoring a dynamic duality, the balance of yin and yang. They observed that yin, which is this passive force, and yang, the active force, basically pervade the human body in the exact same way they pervade the universe as a whole. So in this view, a disease wasn't just some physical breakdown, it was a literal disruption of this dynamic cosmic balance.
And this deeply observational approach extended directly into their vast pharmacopoeia. Think about it. When prescribing a brew made from thousands of medicinal plants or dried animal parts, these healers weren't in a lab analyzing chemical compositions. Instead, they relied on an understanding of the essence of these herbs to create a healing effect. They would carefully choose a formula whose essence or signature energy vibration would correctly stimulate or adjust the patient's own energy vibration, all to restore that vital yin-yang balance. Section 3. Ancient Egyptian Medical Rigor. Moving away from the energy balancing systems of the East, we find a dramatically different and honestly an incredibly strict application of medical observation over in ancient Egypt.
Okay, this quote is wild because it reveals the unbelievably high stakes of early medicine. The ancient Egyptians practiced with highly professional, completely codified methods, and doctors literally functioned under the threat of death. If they didn't follow the treatments recorded in the Hermetic books of Thoth perfectly, it was considered a capital crime. But, and this really shows their capacity for ongoing observation, if a patient didn't improve after 4 days of that strict treatment, the physicians were finally allowed to modify their approach. Talk about pressure.
But despite those rigid rules, or maybe actually because of the intense standardization they created, the Egyptians developed incredibly advanced knowledge of anatomy and surgery from 3300 BCE all the way to 525 BCE. I mean, they were successfully diagnosing and treating immensely complex diseases, things like diabetes, cancer, serious dental issues, and gastrointestinal disorders. Their pharmacopoeia was huge, using minerals, animals, and the whole plant. We're talking the fruit, the leaves, the juice, the roots of species like acacia, coriander, garlic, and lotus. And the craziest part? Some of those exact same plants are still being used today.
Section 4. The Greek Philosophical Revolution. Now let's take a look at how this highly practical, survival-based observation of the natural world eventually shifted into something completely new, the abstract philosophical inquiry of ancient Greece.
So this timeline traces a direct, totally unbroken lineage of brilliant thinkers who basically took the knowledge of the ancient world and completely revolutionized how humanity thought about our own existence. Starting right around the 5th century BC, ancient Greek philosophy really exploded, dealing with everything from astronomy and biology to ethics and logic. And it forms this continuous chain of intellectual evolution, starting with Socrates, passing down to his student Plato, and going right down to Plato's most famous student, Aristotle.
Now, while philosophy definitely existed before Socrates, he fundamentally changed the game for everyone. As the Roman philosopher Cicero later put it, Socrates shifted the focus away from the cosmos and the heavens and aimed it directly onto human behavior and cities. Because of this, he's basically considered the founder of political philosophy. He famously taught that no one actually desires what is bad, and if someone does something truly bad, well, it must just be out of ignorance. Because of that, he declared that all virtue is knowledge. He effectively forced humanity to finally observe itself.
Section 5. Plato versus Aristotle. But the real climax of this explainer, and honestly the true turning point for how we study the natural world, happens right here when we look at the massive ideological clash between Socrates' brilliant successors.
And here we clearly see the ultimate split in how humans decided to observe reality. So on one hand, you have Plato representing Platonism, and he looked entirely to the abstract. He asserted that there are these ideal forms or perfect archetypes, and he believed that the messy, physical, changing world around us is just an imperfect reflection of a higher, unchanging, intelligible realm. But then his student, Aristotle, looked directly back down at the physical dirt, the plants, and the animals around him. Aristotle completely rejected this utopian style of theorizing, and he chose instead to build his theory strictly on the empirically observed behaviors of people and nature in actual reality.
You can really see the friction between them. Aristotle actually criticized the regimes described in Plato's Republic and flat out dismissed his own teacher's theory of forms as just empty words in poetic metaphors. That's a pretty bold move against your mentor, right? Aristotle gave way more weight to empirical observation and highly practical concerns. He actually spent years out in the field studying botany and zoology, and eventually became the personal tutor to Alexander the Great. His total reliance on observed reality made such an unbelievable impact that later medieval and Islamic philosophers like Avicenna simply referred to Aristotle as the master.
Which ultimately brings us to a final, really fascinating thought. As we've seen today, humanity went from observing the universal elements in Ayurveda and the balance of Yin-Yang in Chinese medicine to strictly recording high-stakes treatments in ancient Egypt, all the way to Aristotle categorizing actual plants and animals based entirely on physical, tangible reality. It really leaves us to wonder, by dragging philosophy out of the abstract heavens and forcing it to look closely at the dirt, the leaves, and the physical bodies right in front of us, is this ancient debate exactly what paved the way for the microscopes, the genetics, and the laboratories we rely on today? Think about that the next time you take modern medicine for granted. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep observing and keep questioning.